have to forgive me, I haven't actually given a presentation for quite some time.
I think that was your last one.
I don't remember my last one. It was like last year. That guy's got a Totoro sticker. That is fantastic. My children would be absolutely thrilled to see that. Now, one thing that I'm really excited about in giving this talk is that while I'm still going to be talking about salt, which seems to be the only thing that I ever get to talk about anymore, I get to talk about salt from a perspective other than using it. What I want to talk about is what it's like to manage a large project, and talk a little bit about the metrics of what makes a project a large project, where projects come from, and talk a little bit about the origin of salt and how it got to be what is now one of the largest open source development communities in the world. So, I want to start by defining what makes an open source project big. There's a lot of numbers that we chuck around about saying that's a big project. But I want to dive into some of the metrics that we can actually discuss on a numeric basis instead of just saying, ooh, wow, there's lots of people talking about this thing. And so I'm going to do a little comparison of some known large projects. The Linux kernel, from an open source development perspective, is well beyond massive. The number of people actively contributing to the Linux kernel is staggering. Now, we've all heard of Docker, whether we want to or not. And so I thought that was another good project to do an initial comparison on, to start talking about some of these numbers and metrics. So I'm sorry that some of these might be a little on the small side. They're definitely on the small side. But if you go to openhub.org, you can build these comparisons between projects. And so a couple of things to look at. Let's see, we're able to see that we're comparing Salt, the kernel, and Docker. The next thing is the total number of people who have contributed to the project over the lifetime of its project. So we see Salt there at 1367, the Linux kernel at 13,953, which is, again, I don't think there's any larger development community out there. And Docker at 947 developers. Of course, the Linux kernel has a bit of a head start on everybody. Docker's been moving at a very rapid pace, given its youth, that it's just a little over 2 years old. And Salt is about 4 years old. And then we're also able to see those commit differences with respect to the commit activity. Now, admittedly, a number of these numbers are also generated based on the culture of the project. So, for instance, some projects lean more towards having very, very few commits and squashing everything, and some projects lean towards having many, many commits all over the place. So this is one of those metrics where we might want to take it with a little bit more of a grain of salt. But the thing to keep in mind when we're looking at this metric also is that sometimes people will take, or I shouldn't say sometimes, almost always, when promoting one's project, they will take a single metric and wave it on a flag quite aggressively. And so that's really where I like to come in and talk about the number of lines that are added and changed from the code and its year-over-year activity. That enables us to see whether or not a project has reached what one might call a stable level of maturity, or if the project is still on an upward slope, or if the project is decreasing in activity. And so we're able to see that the Linux kernel has received 40 million lines of changes in the past 12 months, which is a non-trivial, yes, thank you. Oh my gosh. The thing that surprises me is every time I look at the lines changed for Salt, we're above 2 million. And Docker is about 774,000 over there. Okay? And then we're able to see this snapshot of the past 12 months. So despite the fact that the Linux kernel has just shy of 14,000 total developers, we see that over the past 12 months there are about 3,500 developers. Salt's around 660, Docker's around 600. And then the other thing that surprises me, again, is the stability. Docker does not seem to be increasing in their contributions. So, I'll take another approach here with the graph over time. This is another really strong indicator of what's going on inside of an open source community. Because we're able to look at this and we're able to see, is the community staying stable over time, or is the community generally increasing over time? So we have total number of contributors is this graph. Salt is the red, OpenStack Nova is the green. And the Python programming language is the blue line. And so I want to talk about some of the characteristics of a community and how they're reflected in these sorts of lines. I mean, I'd be lying if I said that I didn't want to, say that Salt's awesome because I like my project. But on the other hand, I am trying to extrapolate some real information about what's going on in a project. So we've got Salt here again. Now we're compared with OpenStack Nova and the Python programming language. And so one of the things that's really important to note is that the Python programming language's total numbers of developers relative to the lines that they've added is fairly stable. If we see a project that has a very high number of total developers, but the total number of lines are added is low, then we should be able to extrapolate that individual developers are likely giving less code to the project. It also will tell us a lot about what the characteristic of the average individual developer for that project is. Is this a developer who is going to write a lot of high quality code and that code is going through a very aggressive inclusion? Or is this a developer who finds a quick bug and fixes it, and that's where most of the metrics come from? And so again, when we make these comparisons, Python is a very high quality open source project and community. The code that comes into Python is generally very well reviewed, and we've got very strong and established developers who are writing it. And I'm saying that without highlighting any particular bugs that have happened lately, and Armin Ronacher isn't in here to yell at all of the little idiosyncrasies of Python. Fantastic blog, by the way. Now, similarly, we see with OpenStack a slightly different skew. So we've probably got a lot more production developers who are employed to work on this, and therefore produce a higher volume of code relative to producing very tight, smaller nuggets of code. That fits the type of project that OpenStack is very nicely. So I'd still very much so say that that is a very healthy comparison. Another thing that we noticed is that the age of the project can have a great deal of influence over what those metrics look like. So when we look at Salt, for instance, we've actually got what I hope is a very healthy lineup. But also in the fact that I see what comes into the project, I can tell you that we've got a very broad mixture of people who give us large pieces of code and people who are one-offs. And that's another metric that we don't actually see here that I would love to see OpenHub generate, would be the activity of the contributors themselves. So something I'm increasingly curious about is, out of these numbers, how many of these developers are one commit developers? We see that in many projects that percentage can have a strong bearing on the total activity and total health of the project as well. If you've got, say, 30% of these developers are above 50 commits, then you've got a very dedicated, a very focused, and a very avid developer base. Whereas we see many projects where you may have 1,000 developers, but all of the code is handled by the top 50 developers. So that's another thing that's good to look out for if you're doing community comparisons. Now, I'm going to be a little daring and put our competitors up here. Because the next thing that I want to talk about is that I have been comparing projects that are dramatically different in the scope of what they do. It makes it very easy to come back and say, oh, well, come on, Tom, you know, who's going to write kernel code when they could write some easy Python stuff to shove into a project like SALT? And I've seen a lot of people come back and say config management projects are very skewed towards allowing contribution. And so I've got up here SALT, Puppet, and Ansible. And this chart on the left here is total number of commits, and we've got total number of contributors. One of the things that we like to see inside of a chart to again emphasize stability is that these have a strong move in a certain direction, or that they've got a certain level of stability. And so this is something that historically we've seen a lot of, and when I put these charts together this morning, I hadn't looked at these comparisons for quite a few months. And I have to admit I was very startled to see this, and left me very curious as to why we have a major contribution drop-off in the Ansible and Puppet communities. I'm not speculating as to why that is. I'm just saying that I was surprised to see it happen. Usually and historically, Puppet and Chef have shared basically the same lines. Ansible and us have been very much, as you can see, very much in line. And again, I'm surprised by the drop-off. So that
jumping on your, all those developers haven't suddenly just been contributing to SALT.
That's also a very important thing to keep in mind, is that when we look at, so the CEO of ServiceNow likes to say something. He says there's dollars out there, and if they're not spending them here, they're going to spend them with us. But this is clearly not the case for open source developers. An open source developer isn't just going to jump over to another project overnight. Now granted, we've seen a lot of our contributors hop between different open source projects. And we've seen a lot of people come in and write, say, so the guy who wrote all of our initial Solaris support and contributed it, then went over and wrote it all for Ansible, and then came and give us some more Solaris input, and I was wondering what the devil he's using to manage this infrastructure. So we do see some hopping. But no, that's a very good point. Just because one line goes down, it doesn't mean another line's going to go up. And it's also a question of, does this correlate with, I guess the first thing I was going to say is, does this correlate with Docker? But I don't actually have their graph up here. But their graph doesn't show a spike right now in development. So it's a question of, exactly, where'd they go? And maybe, you know, they're just all busy, I don't know, finishing their taxes or something. Now.
The one thing is the Puppet was updated 4 months ago on that second. Go back, right? No.
Which one? That one?
Right there.
Yeah, this is another thing to be very careful about with. So okay, we go back. Puppet hasn't been updated for a while. That's why Puppet's flatlined. Thank you. Thank you. Ansible was updated 6 days ago.
Could that be explained by them being more controlling about what commits actually get pushed?
It could be. Yeah, like I said, I don't really want to speculate, but we do know that Michael DeHaan was let go from Ansible a few months ago. So their founder is now gone, and they've been in the process of a core code rewrite. Okay. This really ugly guy just stepped at the door. Just terrible looking fellow. Hi, Daniel. Now,
Hey, Tom.
so again, we've got the same lineup here, number of developers over recent timelines, and we can start to extrapolate the same things. Effectively, and again, despite what the graph may lead to believe, I'm still going to argue that these are very healthy communities. But also I'm surprised by code stability, a claim of decreasing code, but again, we have other metrics to look at relative to what's going on inside of these communities. Okay. So that's me just trying to extrapolate quickly what are some of the things that we look at to say, is this a big project? Is this a healthy project? Okay? Now, a little bit of the history on the growth of SALT, and I'll try and talk a little bit about what happens on the growth of an open source project. Because what's really interesting also is to look back and talk about the motivations of creating an open source project. Why would somebody do something like this? One of the things I like to say to new entrepreneurs is that I'm glad that you have no idea what you're getting into, because if you did, you wouldn't do it. It's terrible. Absolutely terrible. And I would say that managing an open source project is definitely absolutely terrible. You never get to sleep. Somebody always wants to tell you that you're an imbecile. And you're developing something which is very visceral and emotional to the people who use it, even if you try to be detached from the emotional argument and keep things by the numbers. So from that perspective, yes, developing an open source project is quite terrible, and if you value sleep and junk, I wouldn't recommend it. Now, but if we go back to the history of SALT, SALT started in February of 2011. Different projects have different trajectories. Some projects have wide popularity and usage curves, and some projects have really steady growth. So I've generally been very happy with the fact that we've been able to maintain steady growth. So despite problems and whatnot that we run into. So in 2012, we see the lineup of the projects with the most developers in them on GitHub. And I think it's really interesting. Rails obviously is still quite high. Homebrew, they're totally flipping cheaters on this list. Because they're a package manager. Of course it's easy to get a lot of people writing packages. We've got CyanogenMod, no surprise there. Does anybody know what CocoaPods is? Yeah.
No idea.
Okay. Does anybody know what Symfony is?
It's the PHP framework.
Excellent. One of the things that I really like about this list is that some of these things I use, some of these things I interact with, some of them I didn't even know were a thing. And it's also one of those re-emphasises. Yes, sorry. And it's kind of one of these introspective moments where I'm able to look back and say, I get really obsessed and excited and about what I'm working on, what I'm doing. But I have no idea what's going on in other worlds. There's whole other worlds that I don't touch. And that I need to be calm and wise and not just go, I'm so great, or, oh no, I've lost 2 people who, are using some other thing now. That the picture of what's going on in the world is substantially bigger. And it also shows that these metrics don't necessarily have any correlation with, say, the monetizability of something from a commercial perspective. If we were to go in and compare GitHub stars, a project may have more GitHub stars than another, but then again there's a project that is a popular swear word that has something like 10,000 GitHub stars that has 0 monetizable capability. And so that's also a very difficult thing when you look at it from the perspective of, are we trying to make a company? Or is this a guy in his basement who just happens to be quite popular? Okay. And that's what GitHub stars say. They say, are you popular? They have nothing to do with, like, making a business. Okay, and so this is the Octoverse for 2013. This is interesting because this is most merged pull requests. So SALT's number 3, there's that CocoaPods again, and Homebrew on most issues closed. So we are fixing our bugs.
Homebrew's got lots of bugs.
No, actually. Okay. All right. So the next thing that I think is really fascinating about looking at projects is their origin and the personalities that are behind the projects and the reasons why they come to be. And so we can look at an a number of projects, and I find this really, really fascinating, that where the origin of the project doesn't really have any bearing on its potential. If there's anything that I've learned, there's absolutely no reason why a guy in his basement can't still disrupt a major industry. I've had a lot of people over the years say, no, the time of the lone wolf developer is dead. It's over. And they're incredibly wrong. Because we're able to salt a lone wolf project. ZermQ is a fairly good sized project. It's a lone wolf project. Docker, of course, sprung out of the ashes of, I just forgot. What was that company? That used to be Docker. Wow, really? Nobody knows? They did a really good job. It was a platform as a service company. .cloud. Yeah. And then they actually sold off their .cloud assets, changed the business name, and raised fresh rounds of capital. And yeah, Cassandra came out of
University, that.
Facebook. Okay. And MongoDB came out of, this is actually a really cool story. Where did Mongo come from?
No idea.
So, if you recall, the Mongo company used to be called 10gen. 10gen originally were trying to build effectively an OpenStack type play. This was, long before OpenStack, and back in the infant days of CloudStack. And so that was what 10gen was trying to do. And then they just happened to find out that that object storage Mongo thing was what people wanted to use. And so they pivoted their entire company to focus just on Mongo and abandoned their efforts to build a larger cloud platform. Okay. Now I will definitely say that the lone wolf approach is quite difficult. If there's one hallmark of making an open source project really successful, it has to do with a violent obsession for its development. And I would say a very unhealthy, violent obsession for the development of the project. Which is why I don't necessarily feel healthy very often. It takes a lot of work, a lot of dedication, a lot of time, and a lot of focus. I mean, when we go back and we look at those charts, we, did 2013, we processed more pull requests than almost any other open source project in the world. I handled over 90% of them myself. That's what it takes, is an unhealthy obsession. If I was a little further on, I might call it dedication and perseverance, but you guys, you're engineers, you know that this is unhealthy.
Don't lose your enthusiasm.
Okay. So, I guess I should have switched the slide. The big difference with the lone wolf is that also, when you've got a lone wolf developer, the danger of that project is the liability of the individual. Is that you've got the liability of how important is this individual to the health of the project? And it's a big question mark. Many projects we never find out. Guido has not left Python. Linus is still working on the kernel. But there are many projects where the founders leave and it falls apart. Because that obsessive, rabid dedication is the only thing that's keeping it going. And I will admit that that is one of the main things that keeps me up at night. To make sure that I do not have a community, overall, company-reaching bus factor. That's bad. But so that is an important liability to keep in mind. Okay. So the next one is that when we talk about the lone wolf, we also end up having a BDFL. This can go both ways. Yeah?
Can you give me the acronym? What does that mean?
Oh, sorry. A BDFL is a benevolent dictator for life. We grant them the B whether they deserve it or not. Or I guess it depends on who you're talking to. Who is it? Leonard Poettering might not think that Linus Torvalds is benevolent. Okay, I got one guy laughing with that. He publicly booted him off of the kernel development at the end of last year. It was great, flagrant, normal Linus Torvalds, much swearing. Okay, so we end up when we see that there is that single individual, it has benefits and caveats. One of the nice things is that the single individual can easily resolve issues. He can say, no, we're not doing that, we're doing this way, we're done. It's over. There's no more debate, we're not going to talk about this for 8 more years. Which is very common inside of corporate or large community scenarios. Which we look at some of the larger pure community developed projects, and they're usually things like like Debian's a really good example. Right, the entire systemd everything is an enormous, massive scale debate for Debian. For Red Hat, a dude says, bump, we're done. So those management structures have a very serious impact on what happens. Neither of these management structures can anywhere near give us an assurance that good decisions are always being made. Okay. One other thing that's really important to talk about when it comes to the activity of a community is also the activity of the people that are involved. If you go to Olo and look at the Python developer specs, despite the fact that I am still the CTO of a company, I rounded this up today, I'm still the most active Python developer in the world. Which still blows my mind, because I do a lot of other crap now. Also, on the list of top 25 Python developers in the world, 6 of them are Salt developers. Somebody on the list just woohooed. Yes, there's Colton, right there. Right there. You proud of yourself, Colton? There. Good man. Okay. So, when you're starting an open source project, why do some projects succeed? Why do some projects fail? Why do some projects have a long life and a long tail and a deep impact? And why do some projects come and go? And why do some projects eventually get completely consumed by the very industry in which they operate? I mean, a good example of that might be the fact that jQuery is now very much absorbed by the sheer functionality of HTML5. And it's also a question of what does the total ecosystem look like? And what does implementing this software actually mean? When we look at JavaScript frameworks, there's a lot of those right now. Same with web frameworks. I find this quite fascinating because at first glance I would think if I've got a web framework, that's very sticky. It can be hard for you to say, well, we've written this in Ruby on Rails, but we're just going to rewrite the whole thing in Django. Who here has been through one of those transitions? Wow, really? Nobody's had to like switch web frameworks in their company? Man, I must be in some boring state.
We've tried it, but people using the old stuff and the new stuff at the same time.
Yeah, well, yeah, and it's hard to jettison the old stuff. It can be very hard to jettison the old stuff. I know we've got Salt deployments where Salt is automating Puppet and Chef at the same time, and CF Engine. It happens fairly often. So, like our biggest user of Salt, our publicly biggest. We've got bigger ones, but they won't only tell you who they are, jerks. One of them actually pays me to keep my mouth shut that they use Salt. Like we've got a contract with them, and in the contract it says if you ever tell anyone that we use you, there'll be penalties, and we will deny it. And their deployment's larger than LinkedIn. But LinkedIn's our biggest, vocal customer. They still use CF Engine for a lot of things. And basically because they've got like 2 guys left that won't let go of setting up their bare metal with CF Engine. So it's really fascinating. It's very hard to let go. But so when we look at an industry, it's really fascinating because generally I would think that the difficulty of letting go would also play a really heavy impact on the stickiness of the project. But we see web frameworks and JavaScript framework come up and go all the time. So it's a question about what are the other factors that actually make a project sticky, instead of just going, well, I think I've got a good idea, let's try this out. A really good example, for instance, would be the huge effort behind Pyramid. Sorry, it used to be Pylons. Wait, it's Pyramid now, right? This is actually, branding's still important, by the way. Okay.
So what is that?
Pyramid, which used to be Pylons, it's a Python web framework. And it was basically annihilated by the weight and breadth of Django. Which is too bad. I thought it was very well written. Okay. Now, and it's definitely still out there. It's still a thing. But, you know, people say, what's Pyramid? Instead of, who here knows what Django is?
They've heard of it.
I was about to say, see, you're just now raising your hands when I ask you questions. Okay, so there's a lot of different factors that need to be considered. One of the major pieces to consider is that if you're working on an open source project and you're only going to give a philosophical change or an incremental change to the people who would use it so that you're selling a preference, then there's a really strong question about your ability to endure. If you're able to make a project, so you can win on preference, but the only way you can win on preference is if the market that you are addressing is ridiculously massive. That you can just get a lot of people who go, I just like this because I like this. Okay? How long do I have? 45 minutes? When do I have to
45. You started half hour ago about 15 minutes.
Okay, thanks. So, in config management, the market is massive, so you would think that we'd be able to win purely on preference. How many config management players are there?
4 or 5.
So I heard of 5. Anyone else?
Probably a bazillion.
I just need it well known.
Yeah, there's a bazillion. I mean, I don't actually have a number. I mean, but it's high. I mean, there's all sorts of these little guys. Microsoft released one yesterday. Wait, that was this morning. Was that this morning? They all bleed together. There's a new guy on the block all the time. So why is it that there are 4 that we talk about? Why is it that so many of these others don't tend to stick? And so I'll give you some of the reasons. Now, you don't have to, all of these reasons don't have to apply, just some of them. One of the really big ones is the ability to retrofit. People today, developers today, love to write code that only works on all the newest crap. And so the only way to run it is to install a data center full of Arch Linux servers. Because your stuff doesn't work on anything less than Python 3.4.3 because of some bug they fixed. This is extremely common. The big 4 config management players retrofit. Linux retrofits. It works on old crap. For the most part.
Anyone who runs old crap a lot, Linux does pretty good.
Okay. I thought somebody was going to suddenly throw a NetBSD tomato at my face.
Probably more likely Open.
OpenBSD is great. PCBSD recognizes us as the only management system. I like those guys.
Big Linux doesn't work on old crap, though. I often have to
No, that's a good point.
hack it pretty hard.
But so the ability to retrofit is really important. One thing that I like to emphasize is that a lot of people like to say, I'm going to build a new tech company, I'm going to build a new project, and it addresses a market that we're trying to create. Follow me into this brave new world, they say. Instead of saying, I could displace $20 billion of what somebody else is doing really easily by making something that doesn't suck. Those projects stick. Even though we all talk about the Brave New World projects, those projects stick. Okay? The next one is the question of what is the level of incremental change that you can enact in someone's life? Are you going to take their processes from 10 minutes to 9 minutes? Or are you going to take their processes from 10 days to 10 seconds? If what you're developing isn't going to give somebody a legitimate order of magnitude increase in their in the efficiency of what they're doing, then you're going to have a hard time getting major traction. Now, there are parts of salt that give an order of magnitude increase, and there are parts that just don't. You know, they'll give a 50% increase, or maybe they're on par, or maybe somebody argues that somebody else is a little better there. But you've got to have something that's going to give somebody a legitimate enough increase to hop the wall. Okay? And that allows you to fundamentally displace the guys that are behind you. Okay. Some of the things that we did from a salt perspective had to do with the flexibility of the project. Like I was saying before, if you've got a massive, wide field of possible users, then your ability to breach into that area is much bigger, even on minor improvements. So one of the reasons I made salt so ridiculously, nauseatingly flexible was to actually broaden the field. It's a lot easier, again, to get that traction when you've got a bigger field, which is why we power weather station Raspberry Pis in South Africa, and why salt's used to manage medical devices. The wide field, the flexibility, gives you, again, the sticking power. Okay? I'm trying to wonder, you know, you ever get into a talk and you forget what the next slide is? Because I'm not, okay, I've got a nod. Thank you. Thank you, very hip gentleman in the hoodie. Okay. So one of the things that I get asked, I get a lot of common questions. And one of them, of course, is why Python? Does anyone out here want to tell me why Python is a good choice?
Python's always a good choice.
Portability. Python's always a good choice. Anybody else?
Brevity.
Brevity. Excellent.
Debug.
Easy to debug. Yes, until you get into coroutines and zero Q, yes.
I don't know this for sure. I mean, you haven't debug it, but it seems like for an open source project, you're going to be more open to contributors because they're not going to have to learn all the crazy weird things about some of the more eccentric languages.
Easy to learn. It's not OCaml.
Yeah. It's not what?
OCaml. I love OCaml. I learned a lot from OCaml. I'll never use it, but it was a wonderful learning experience. Yeah, those are fantastic reasons. A couple others are, what is the maturity of the ecosystem? Is the ecosystem one that is strong and on one of those strong trajectories? Or is it on a declining trajectory? And how well established is the tool that you're using? So I'm trying to say this also from just a generic pick a tool kind of thing. How well established is that tool? If we look at Python, Python is sufficiently well established that PyPy exists. So we can always say to the argument of Python's so slow, just run on PyPy, it's fast then. And Cython exists. And even crazy esoterics like Nuitka exist. Nuitka's really cool. Who here's heard of Nuitka? I know you have because I talk about it all the time at the office. So Nuitka is a Python to C to machine code compiler. So you can compile your entire Python project down to a single binary and ship it out a la Go style. But another question is, are you picking a tool because you like a tool or because it fits your use case? One of the main reasons why Python was clearly the choice over something like Go is because of the way Salt's plugin systems work. Go systems don't have that same, Go doesn't have the same flexibility there. And so dynamic code loading is one of the biggest reasons why I chose Python. And not just because I happen to know Python better than anything else at the time. That was definitely also a player. Okay, I've already talked about this. I'm terrible. Sorry. Okay. So, effectively the crux of what I wanted to get across was that I had no idea what I was doing or what I was getting myself into when I started writing Salt. Writing an open source project and making it win doesn't mean that you have a brilliant flash of an idea one day that you can pivot your whole life around. I spent the first year of Salt, I started writing Salt thinking, well, this will be fun. I've written similar things a bunch of times. I'm obsessed with the problem space. I'll just try and do it. But I didn't think it would get to be one of the world's largest open source communities. I didn't begin to imagine that at the beginning. Those stupid jerks at LinkedIn who started using Salt when it was 4 months old because they're reckless, very reckless, didn't tell me until a year after that. And I tried to explain to them then why I was angry and why it would have been so much easier to raise money had I known. But so I guess what I'm saying is kind of this double-edged sword. If you want to go out and make an open source project, if you want to go out and make an open source community, it's a lot of hard work to win. There is not necessarily a pot of gold at the end of your rainbow. Will it likely make it easier for you to get a better job? Yes. Will it make you some celebrity that everyone knows and loves? No. I mean, every now and then I'll go to a conference and I'll get a little group of people who want to talk to me, but that's it. Which is good. I don't know. Is it something that you're going to necessarily start and see the full vision of? No. Is it something that you should compete with me in? No. And so again, the crux of what I'm saying is that this is something that can be done. But it's really hard work. And if you want to make a company out of it, make sure that you understand some form of monetization before you just say, I've got a good idea and a VC is going to give me money. Now the follow-up to that is that a lot of VCs will give you money for a good idea that won't make any money. There are many, many examples strewn through the annals of history that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars. I used to work for a company that raised over $33 million, and they never made a dime. Okay? All right, so I'm trying to think. Yeah, we make proprietary software. We've got some big stuff coming out pretty soon. This is actually from a corporate perspective, and I'm out of time. From a corporate perspective, if you want to turn an open source project into a company, a lot of investors will not require that you tell them how you're going to make money until they've really got a hold of you, and then you get fired. Which is why there's a limit to how many investors we have. But one of the philosophies that we've got, and one of the problems that we see very regularly in open source companies, is that the first thing they try and do is monetize their community. and say, hey, you've been giving us code, you use our stuff, now pay us money. Instead of understanding that the peripherals around the needs of that community is where most of the money is. And then a lot of projects, we see their open source project taper off because they start putting all of their effort into a proprietary product and say open source stuff doesn't matter anymore. A smart open source move is to say that if we're making proprietary software, it needs to benefit the open as well. It needs to be something that doesn't cut off our ability to develop more open source code. The reason open core is bad has nothing to do with philosophy or religious ideas about what free software is. It's because open core says, I'm not going to really ever let you have feature Y in open source anymore. And that it kills the community. And it stifles it. It puts a noose around its neck. But if you're able to develop proprietary, I know the slide's terrible, I don't even know what those words say. But if you're able to develop proprietary technology which is complementary to what is open source, that they can work in a truly symbiotic relationship without neutering the open source, then you're able to build something which has long-term potential. We're hiring. And the last question a lot of people ask me is, what are my days filled with? They're filled with sadness and sorrow because I'm in like business meetings and I review a crap load of pull requests. Not as many anymore. We've got internal process and other people who are very bright who help with that. And I don't get to write as much code. Although if you add my nights, then I write more code. But that's also a lot of what it boils down to. Even when you get to the point where something's more established, you still don't get your nights back if you want it to succeed. All right. Any questions? Normally I'd approve a pull request. That was the plan, but we're out of time, and I haven't been able to connect to the Wi-Fi yet. So any questions, comments, arguments, rotten fruit?
How long was it that you started working on Salt and doing all the open source stuff before you started also adding in the enterprise side and the closed source products? How long did you have to go before you had a big enough following to actually be able to monetize it?
About 3 years.
And so is all that just venture capital money, or how did you keep everything going?
Year one was my savings, which was then gone. Year two was small private investors. Year three was larger private investors. I get to compare Salt to Docker. How much money has Docker raised? Does anybody know? $195 million. We have raised less than 6. Money does not buy product. Work does. A willingness and a squeezing of the mind to say, I gotta figure this out. That's what does it. Not money. Okay. Anybody else, or should I free you all? Many people have already left. I'm not hurt, I understand. I know I'm generally boring. I have children, they tell me all the time. Okay, any other questions?
I heard a rumor you guys were rewriting 0MQ,
You heard a rumor that we were rewriting 0MQ.
or making an alternative or something.
Yeah. Actually, in all honesty, we hope that Salt will have no dependency on 0MQ within a year or so. Right now we have a UDP protocol called RATE, which is a pure Python reliable message-based UDP protocol, which has encryption and handshake built into it. It's a really fantastic protocol. And it was introduced in Salt 2014.7 as beta. It's a lot more stable in 2015.5, which we will announce on Monday as being released. You know, it's up on PyPy right now if you want it. We also, in the next release of Salt, which we're targeting for August, not the past.
Could be April 26th.
I sure hope not. If it is, you're fired. Okay. In that release, we now are also introducing a new TCP approach that isn't ZeroMQ. It's based entirely on Tornado.
Way cool.
It's very cool, and in our preliminary test, it's slightly faster than ZeroMQ. So, yes. Any other questions?
How do I get hired?
How do you get hired at SaltStack? You submit a resume. You get kind of lucky. Oh, I'm terrible at getting people through the hiring process. No, in all honesty, I'm terrible at it.
You have any ops positions open?
Do we, actually, yeah, that guy right there, Daniel Bray, if you want to get hired at SaltStack, talk to him. Okay. Any others? Okay.